Hello, and welcome to Lion and Mouse Commentary. I'm Tori, and this is my best friend, Holland.
Hello.
If you're new to our show, we rank various forms of entertainment by different categories out of a total score of 10, with only 2 points allowed for our personal taste. We'll break everything down as we go, so don't worry. Feel free to agree, disagree, or just find something new to enjoy. But tread lightly, because there will be hot takes and spoilers. Cut to the intro. All right, happy Halloween. Today I chose Howl's Moving Castle, the Studio Ghibli film, for us to review. This is familiar to me.
Yes,
familiar to you?
In technicality only.
Okay.
I have seen, prior to reviewing it for this episode, I saw it one time and literally had no memory of it.
Okay.
So,
well, if this is new,
my brain dumped it.
If this is new to you, here is some spoiler-free background before we get into our scores. So, Howl's Moving Castle was released September 5th, 2004. So it's the 20th anniversary this year.
It is.
As of this episode being recorded and released. It was directed by Hayao Miyazaki and screenplay by him as well. It was based on the 1986 novel by Diana Wynne Jones. And it was produced by Toshio Suzuki. It has a running time of 119 minutes, budget of $24 million, international box office came out to $236 million. So they did good. I watch the English dub. Nothing against the original Japanese,
did as well.
But I find it easier on my brain sometimes to not have to read the subs. So the English voice actors that I will be basing a lot of my analysis on are these. Top 6 were Emily Mortimer, Gene Simmons, Christian Bale, Lauren Bacall, is that how you say that?
Sure.
Billy Crystal, and Josh Hutcherson. And then the Google synopsis, because I find that the Google synopsises have been really kind of funny. So the Google synopsis is this. Sophie has an uneventful life at her late father's hat shop, but all that changes when she befriends Wizard Howl, who lives in a magical flying castle. However, the evil Witch of the Waste takes issue with their budding relationship and casts a spell on young Sophie, which ages her prematurely. Now Howl must use all of his magical talents to battle the jealous hag and return Sophie to her former youth and beauty, which I feel like honestly just scrapes the surface of the plot.
It's not really the plot at all.
It's not really the plot. I feel like it's actually more of like the subplot.
Well, I feel like they got the first half.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So not my favorite synopsis. We'll talk about it more as we go. But with that being said, you want to go ahead and kick us off, Holland, with our first category?
So happy Halloween and happy end of season 3 part A. So this is our last episode before we take a break for the holidays, because we have the busiest time of our year in our normal everyday full-time jobs are the holiday season.
Yeah.
So we will be taking a brief hiatus. This will be our last episode for the fall season, part of our season, and then we will be resuming beginning of January for the next one. So I just wanted to give that little plug there because you mentioned Happy Halloween. And I realized here we are. It's already halfway through.
This is our Halloween episode.
It's our halfway mark.
Yeah.
So our first category is plot and story delivery. Total possible score of 2. I gave this movie, I had to think. I was like, this show. Nope, it's a film. I gave this film half a point out of 2. So I think I need the big disclaimer of the Studio Ghibli films. I understand there is a huge cult following for these films, and they are very respected and they're very well renowned. Again, I'm not discrediting any of that in these individual categories. So I don't want anybody to think that I'm just out to dump on, Studio Ghibli as a studio. I just think objectively from the plot standpoint, I think this film leaves much to be desired. So in general, I think the setup of the plot is pretty good. It's got some good solid pieces there. So the setup of the plot is that we have Sophie, our main protagonist, who is very early on in the film is cursed to be, very old. She's like turned into an old lady. We hear through kind of like background character exposition that Howl is this wizard who's very dangerous. And also that Howl is kind of being pursued by the Witch of the Waste, who is the individual that curses Sophie. So it's kind of this interesting like dynamic that like the enemy of my enemy, my friend, for Sophie's standpoint, which that's kind of left a little ambiguous at the beginning. There's also this kind of throwaway background story of this prince that's missing. And then here we have this other background plot of Sophie being in the hat shop and how I believe the character is her sister, talks about how, why do you stay at that hat shop? Just because father wanted you to, if it's not what you want to do, you don't have to. And Sophie's like, no, I'm very happy. It's what father would have wanted. I mean, that's kind of at the beginning. And then there's this kind of overarching war plot where the wizards are being recruited to participate in the war. All of that information is given to us very early on in the film. And all of that sounds very interesting. And yet the plot never really goes very far with much of any of that. I feel like the plot has spread itself way too thin in this film. And some of those plot points are never even addressed. The kind of exposition of this, and while I respect it because I think that it does a nice job of not insulting the intelligence of your audience, which I love when a film does that. It allows you to just glean information without spelling it out for you. For example, this is neither a pro nor a con, but quite a few of those plot points are given in the exposition dialogue of background characters. The whole plot of A Missing Prince isn't given to you, except you're watching Sophie maybe walk down an alleyway or something, and these two characters, like way in the background, are the ones having a conversation about, oh, the prince is missing, the king's gonna go to war over it. You're like, oh, well, that's interesting. And then it's just left cold for the whole rest of the film. The whole concept with Sophie working in the hat shop, again, is not addressed at all for the rest of the film. That is never tied up, it's never resolved, it's never addressed other than these lines in the background. This whole plot of Howl, is he this dangerous wizard who eats the hearts of attractive young women? Again, that's given to us as exposition of these background characters that are working in the hat shop with Sophie. And then we never hear anything from that. Is it true or not? We literally don't know if this is ever really true about this main character who's the titular character of the film. We never find out if that's really true or not, or what's the deal with any of that.
Is it just rumors?
Right. Is it just myth and legend?
People talking and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Yeah.
Or is there some truth to it? And so I think that overall for a film, regardless of the type of medium, you have about 2 hours to deliver your plot. And here I've just listed kind of the key components of this film, and only about half of them are followed through on. And I would say probably only maybe 1 or 2 are followed through with substance. And I feel like the rest of it is just kind of given to us. And while it's not insulting the intelligence of your audience to assume that they can glean this information as they go, it's like the whole plot is just given to you. You're kind of like a fly on the wall observer, and we're not really giving you any compulsion of what to buy into in this plot. We don't heighten the stakes. This war is really dangerous. Here are these people you're seeing impacted. Howl is really scary. Like, you're seeing him, character. You don't have any attachment to specific characters involved in these different plots to give you any buy-in to the plot. And I think that's the biggest problem with this film. So I know that's quite a broad statement for me to give, but that's overall why I didn't give this very much credit for the plot, because I think that's kind of problematic through the whole thing. I think that there are some things that are just overall kind of like few points that are a little problematic. So kind of the main plot of this story, I would say, if you had to summarize the whole plot, is that Howl is missing his heart and Sophie is cursed and wants to have that curse reversed because she's young, but she's taking the form of an old lady version of herself. So we don't really, and then I would think that the overall plot resolution is Hal's heart is returned to him. The whole plot with Howl and Calcifer, that is resolved. I think how it's resolved is a bit confusing. The way that and then the other main plot with Sophie, the reason for the resolution is never explained, and it's not. It seems like she's our main protagonist that we're following from the get-go, and then towards the end, it feels like everything that happened throughout the film in regards to her breaking the curse was pointless.
Right.
Because she seemingly just slowly starts to age back to her real age. So what was the point of her even finding Hal, being involved with Hal, any of that? It all seemed really kind of unnecessary. Overall, I had a couple of specific notes. I think that the fact... Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
It's okay.
So however you can edit this.
No, that's fine.
So my main problem is that I like the plot unfolding as we go, but because we're kind of piecemealing all of these little plots together, it doesn't give us much buy-in from the get-go. And I kind of clocked it about halfway through the movie. The only plot that we care about is Sophie's curse being lifted. And then she's getting younger on her own, so what was the point? So she didn't need anybody to lift the curse for her. And then the other kind of main character of Hal, like, the introduction of him is, like, a little creepy. Like, him just kind of, like, taking Sophie by the arm in the alleyway and is like, don't worry, I'll take care. I mean, it seems like really trying way too hard with, like, a romance plot between the two of them. And it doesn't really feel believable. And then throughout the rest of the plot, this maybe romance that we're kind of sold at the very end, I don't see any buy-in to that, which can come into character notes as well. I feel like the plot between Sophie and Hal feels very much like a Beauty and the Beast type plot. It just feels very derivative of that. But except that they're both cursed instead of Hal just being cursed as the Beast, like Sophie's cursed as well. So that felt pretty derivative. We don't really have an antagonist of this film. I guess you could say the Witch of the Waste is an antagonist initially because she curses Sophie to begin with, but then she's off screen the whole rest of the film. And then we introduce her again, and now she is, her magic is taken away from her by this other sorceress. And so now she's a good guy. So she was our antagonist, and now we have the sorcerer and the king that are causing this war as our main antagonists. But we don't have any motive. And this, I clocked it. It was like an hour and 10 minutes into this 2-hour film. So we don't care about we don't have any compulsory plot until about halfway through the film. And then we're kind of swapped from the plot being about Sophie to now this plot being about the war. So we don't have an antagonist until about halfway through the film. And then it's all wrapped up kind of messily at the end. So those are some kind of generic things. A couple other things I thought that a lot of the scenes were a little unnecessary, where the way that Hal is like has to move the house after when he decides like we need to move the house because they're gonna find me. The way he moves the house, I feel like that was unnecessary. The whole scene where he takes Sophie to the fields with the ponds, like the pools of water, that all wasn't really necessary. The whole plot with Sophie and Hal, their romance plots, was completely unnecessary to the rest of the plot. The whole war subplot, moving into when they take the sorceress's dog and the witch home, like that I thought was really nonsensical. It contributed nothing to the plot to have the two of them along for the ride for the rest of things. The kind of climax of the film where the castle collapses and Sophie saves Calcifer, which you find out later is Hal's heart. That whole part, like everybody is just being stupid. Like that's from then on. It's like people are just making dumb decisions, and that's what's the cause of conflict there. The whole fact towards the end where Hal's heart getting returned to him, if you will, that being resolved. The whole part with the ring was really not well defined. It's like he gives it to her and says, this is how you can always make sure you'll be able to find your way back to the castle. And then it's a locator beacon to help find Howl, but then it's a time travel machine which takes her back in time to find a young Howl.
Yeah, I have some notes about that kind of stuff.
Like,
yeah.
all of these things are just, nothing was established at the beginning. That compounded with the fact that when Sophie's cursed, she has this complete nonchalant attitude about magic in general and being cursed. Like, she has almost no reaction. It was just like, okay, so magic is such a commonplace thing, but then we don't have any like rules or understanding of how this magic actually works. So I can't make sense of any of it. And then you could have had Madame Solomon or the war happen as kind of your overall, like your big, threatening plot, but to have them both just seemed really unnecessary. I even thought for a minute there, well, is Madame Solomon controlling the king and making a war so that she can get all the wizards and trick them? But no, all the wizards are fighting for the war, and so it's not like she was trying to trick all her wizards to come back to take their powers away. Like, that wasn't even really a plot. Overall, it just was very, very messy. There wasn't really like a singular thread you could like follow through, with the exception of Sophie being cursed. But then again, like I said, she's fixing the curse on her own, or maybe it's just wearing off. We don't have any understanding or explanation of that by the end of it. And then at the very, very end, it's like, okay, well, maybe the war started because this prince went missing, and then you find out that the scarecrow that's been hopping around was the missing prince, and he was cursed. And so it's like, but that was just like a throwaway resolution at the very end. So none of it felt satisfying when we got any of these plots resolved, because we had to follow like 10 different plots throughout this film, and none of them were followed very clearly. It was just like, all right, you're going to have to piece the plot together. You're going to have to watch this film and figure it out as you go. You figure out what the significance is and what you maybe, and I understand that some forms of art, like it's up, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's left up to the audience to interpret. Like, I don't think that's a valid excuse for giving you a film which is very, I would say very structured storytelling, and not giving you something to hold on to actually follow and give you something to buy into and believe in. So I think that was kind of a broad, like, commentary on this category, but that was in general what I found kind of problematic. And then to kind of sum it all up, we have kind of a little tenet of this category where it's like, what's the theme, what's the moral, what's the message, what's the gist of what are we supposed to come away with and take away from this? And I literally wrote next to it, what's the point? Because at the end of this film, I couldn't tell you what the point was. I could tell you how it ended, what conflict was resolved at the end. Howl gets his heart back. Sophie's not cursed anymore. Mm-hmm. The prince was found. But I didn't have any buy-in along the way to really feel satisfied with that at the end. So I gave it half a point because, again, I think that overall, the kind of fragments that we have are really interesting, but it just didn't land as well as I think that it should have for, what we were kind of set up to believe we were getting into. So half a point out of 2.
Okay, so for me, for plot and story delivery, I gave this 1 out of 2 points. I actually really, really agree with a lot of what you said, and I have very similar notes. I just didn't deduct quite as much as you did, but I think everything you said was absolutely valid. So my, I guess, overall disclaimer is that I do enjoy Ghibli films, but I have to acknowledge, while being as objective as possible for this episode, that this suffers from what I would consider, and I have not seen every Ghibli film, but I've seen a lot of the ones that came out in like the late 90s, early 2000s, like this one. And it suffers from what I call classic Ghibli nonsense, which is sometimes you just don't really understand what's going on. And you said you like when a piece of media does not insult your audience's intelligence, and I fully agree. But I think what happened with this film is that they have all these different plots / subplots, all these threads moving. And every single one of those threads is interesting and intriguing and could be really, really cool, but there's too many of them. And so you can't commit the time that you need to each plot in order to find yourself invested in it as an audience member, because you only have 2 hours. So now you're trying to cram all of this into 2 hours, and it suffers from not taking proper time into each plot point for me to feel like I care about the resolution of this conflict or whatever it is. And yes to the comment that you had about magic. So I fully believe if you are going to incorporate magic in any capacity, in any sort of book, movie, game, if you're going to commit to using magic in your story and have that be central to the plot of the story and or characters, you must establish rules to this magic.
I agree.
And
well, it's like science. Like, we understand that scientific things have rules that they follow.
And you can have your magic do whatever you want it to do, but you need to help us understand how it works, because even the most fantastical magic needs to have some sort of rule or limit to it. And we are given no understanding or context to any of the magic used by any character in this entire movie.
I think the only rule we are given is that if somebody's cursed, they can't talk about it.
Correct.
But even then, that's not really a hard and fast rule, because the Witch of the Waste says the nice thing about that curse is you won't be able to talk about it.
And the only other rule that I was able to gather from this film is that if Calcifer dies, so does Howl.
Right.
That's the only other rule that they give you in the entire plot. It's like, you can't snuff me out. Howl will die if you do. And it's okay. And then you go, okay, so now I understand as an audience member that their fates are tied.
But also, we don't really know at that point if Calcifer is somebody that can be trusted.
Right.
He could just be saying that for self-preservation. Sure. Because he says, I'm a fire demon.
Right.
But
I guess my point here is that if every magic, curse, how the castle works is all very vague, and a lot of it is kind of explained away with like, only Howl knows, or, the Witch of the Waste has motives that we try to understand. Like, but your job as a storyteller is to help us understand.
Right.
Because now if the motive of your character is, well, only she knows or only he knows, well, now I don't have any reason to like care. Because if you're going to brush me off, and, it's not the audience that it's being said to, but it kind of is, because it's being said to Sophie.
Right.
And if Sophie's the character that we're following from beginning to end, and she's being brushed aside that way, Sophie may go, okay, but I don't.
Right.
Because I'm like, well, then, why do I care? What is the point? What is the reason? What is the motive? And you don't have to be explicit in that, but you have to give me enough of a glimpse that I care to keep going.
Even Twilight found a way to give us some rules.
So, and it's unfortunate because, like you said at the beginning, the Ghibli films are so revered and loved by many. And I would I don't think I would necessarily call myself a Ghibli fan, but I do enjoy Ghibli movies. And, I find myself happy to watch them. And I was still happy to watch this. So I don't want to sound like completely negative and everything. But I think another problem that I have with the plot is that it's presented as sort of this mystery, war, magic, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy kind of vibe. And so many things happen without much explanation or understanding. And then on the other side of the coin, the mood of a lot of this film feels more like a slice of life, feel-good film. And they don't match up.
Yeah.
It's like I want one or the other. And if you're going to commit to this sort of like vague, magic, who's good and who's bad, then I want the mood to follow that closer. And I feel like it doesn't. And while I'm not saying that a plot that heavy should not have moments of levity, it should. The way that so many scenes are presented, it's kind of just like Sophie living her life in the castle, finding herself content with this life as an old lady. And then you're like, okay, well then what? If she's content, then what's the motivation to get the curse lifted in the end? You know, if she's like, well, I just like, you know, I like this life. You know, I kind of live humbly, you know, as a hat shop worker anyway. So if my new life is to live as an old lady housekeeper to this wizard, then cool. Like, then I'll just live here. And then you're like, all right, movie's over. Roll the credits. So it just feels like they don't, it's like they didn't know what they wanted from the film. They wanted kind of like the almost darker, heavier notes, maybe to appeal to more adult audiences. But then they wanted the like, ha, funny, you know, slice of life, feel good, you know, scenes maybe to appeal to a younger audience. I don't know the reason. It just felt like it didn't match a lot of the time. I don't understand Sophie's curse at all. I was really trying to figure it out, and I was trying to pay attention enough to be like, is there something that happens or goes on maybe verbally or emotionally? Why does she suddenly sometimes just become younger again? And it's like sometimes she's not even all the way back to her normal age. She just kind of maybe goes back 10-ish years or 20-ish years. And so she's still older, but like she's not all, you know, like hunched over. I think
she's progressively getting younger throughout the film. But then there's moments like when Hal comes in the house at night and she's sleeping, she's completely her young self,
right? But
I was trying to figure out, is that just because Hal can see that that's her real
so that's
form?
what I was trying to figure out too. I was trying to figure out but then there were moments where she almost reverts back to like fully hunched over,
right.
So it's like she continues to kind of go back and forth throughout the whole thing. And I was trying to figure out, okay, is it maybe related to Sophie's confidence in the moment? Is it related to how Howl perceives her in that moment? Is it related to... I was really trying to figure it out through the whole thing. Like, is there some commonality or thread that I could follow that makes it make sense? And I couldn't find any true, like, parallel to follow.
Yeah.
So, again, it's like, establish some rules here.
Right.
You know? Also, I'm sorry, but I kind of got ticked at the end when they reveal that the prince is the scarecrow. Mm-hmm. Like, are you telling me we've been going to war for you because you've been missing? So now, you know, the whole world or whatever is in chaos over this war, and you've literally been here the entire time.
But they were at war before the prince was missing. Like, before they even said...
But then why did they have the whole plot point in the beginning where it's like, the prince is missing, so the king's going to go to war because of it? Because, you know, he assumes that the prince has been taken or whatever.
Right.
So it's like, I don't understand.
Well, he was cursed.
Right.
It wasn't his fault.
Right. I get it. But it's like, no indication whatsoever. I feel like it, in my opinion, it kind of felt like a cheap, like, we have to wrap this plot point up. So
it did feel like that.
So now, how do we explain, you know, how do we resolve the war plot? Prince is missing. We're going to make him the scarecrow.
Haha, plot twist.
Okay, now that's resolved. Everybody's happy. And so I just felt like that was such an unsatisfying way to like resolve that plot of, I thought, like, it was a good
twist, but I think it would have made so much more sense if we just had, like, let's commit to the war plot.
Right. We need to
And
commit to something and then just let everything else like fall to the wayside. But there was no commitment to really any plot point. Like any plot thread. And that's my big problem.
I'm really curious what your thoughts are because you read the book.
I did.
And so I'm really curious what your thoughts are as far as like how well was it adapted?
It has been many years since I have read the book, maybe 10 or 12. Like, it's been a long time. However, I don't really remember the war plot being present in the book at all. Now, I could be wrong. I could just not be remembering, but I don't really remember that being present at all. I feel like it was really way more focused on like Sophie and her curse. That was like the plot. Mm-hmm. And then kind of Howl's mysteriousness and is he involved? Is he not involved? Can he help her? Can he not? That was more of like his character arc, was just like he was like this mysterious guy. He was not quite as nice to Sophie in the book. I could be completely misremembering, but just to my recollection from years ago, I feel like it takes him a lot longer to kind of warm up to her and trust her. but I don't remember the war plot being present at all in the book.
So it clearly wasn't significant.
Right. So, I do think, though, to kind of end on a happier note, I do think that the dialogue and the writing is really decent. And I think that it's a shame that we didn't, just the way that the plot points are laid out doesn't give us enough opportunity for character dialogue to really, and this is going to bleed into some things I say about characters. But I think it's a shame that we didn't have enough of that really good dialogue devoted to the plot points that should matter or shouldn't matter. It's just, there's too much. They tried to cover too much ground, and it just ended up messy, like you said, and really unsatisfying because you're not given enough opportunity to kind of like attach yourself to any of those plot points. So all of that to say, 1 out of 2 points for me for plot.
Cool. Okay, so our next category is characters. Total possible score of 3. I gave this another 0.5 point out of 3, which, I mean, I'm going to talk about the visuals and aesthetics because I think there's many kudos to some of these character designs. However, I think there's a lot of issues with the characters overall. I think I could generalize the reason for my score with this category by saying I think that these characters they have a good start and they're generally likable and interesting, but they're extremely flat and dull for the whole 2 hours of the film. There's not really any growth in these characters. There's not really a lot of change. We don't get good snapshots of their relationship between other characters. There's no growth in the relationship with other characters. We don't understand the motive of any of these people. There's no depth. We don't understand anything about them. We don't know anything about them. And in general, I think they try and build these characters as a family, but we didn't witness any bonding between these people or any change in their relationship as the time of the movie goes on. So that's kind of my overall broad statement. I think when you have characters that are that flat to the extent where they don't even really interact with each other or have interrelational actions between each other, I think that's problematic. And like you said, I feel like this movie kind of bounces back and forth between this dark, edgy war magic plot and then happy little slice of life plot. So those slice of life moments should give us this depth of character and these interrelational interactions with each other, and we don't get that. And that dark, quote unquote darker themes or visuals or the war and the magic, the
serious moments,
the more serious plot points should then give us some conflict where we watch our characters push against that and grow and overcome it and overcome adversity and problems, and we don't get that either. So it's like the plot and the characters are supposed to press against each other so we have growth and change in both of those, and we have neither. We don't have any of that. It's as if the characters are here and the plot's here and they just kind of exist in the same space, but there's no interaction with each other. And so overall, that's kind of my broad summation of why I didn't give it very many points. I do have some specific things, a few positives, and unfortunately mostly negatives. Sophie, I think it's really nice that we are shown that she's really clever. She thinks quick on her feet. She's very likable. We see her as a hard worker. We're introduced to her as she cares about her family. She's very happy and content where she's at, even though it's not this, glamorous. Or I like that we have this female protagonist who's just very happy where she's at, and she's not the stereotype of a woman who's, stuck in her mundane life and I just want adventure. And she's not this woman who's like, oh, I just want a white knight to come sweep me off my feet and romance me away. And she's not in this other end of the stereotype where she's like, I'm just so depressed because my life isn't going anywhere, or I'm really ambitious and I want my business to take off. She's just happy with her life, where she's at. And then she has this unfortunate circumstance happen to her. And we get to watch her, you know, kind of come into her own throughout that, but not really. Like, she seems to be the same at the end as she was at the beginning. We didn't really watch any change in her at all. The whole point with her being in love with Howl, she talks about how she's in love with him. Why? You've interacted with him twice, maybe. Like, nothing's happened in your interactions with him. So why are you in love with him? Because he's pretty? Like, I mean, is that the reason? We're not even given that as the reason. That she's just enamored that he's this attractive young wizard with magical powers. We don't even get that. She's just out of the blue. She's just enamored. She's spouting his praises, and then at the end she's in love with him. It literally made no sense. Did she have Stockholm syndrome because she's living in his house? Like, none of that made any sense. Howl's introduction for him as a character, I almost literally gagged. I thought it was just absolutely, like, stupid. When he, like, comes in next to Sophie and is like, he, like, stands there. It was stupid. It was so stupid. It's like heavy-handed. It was overplayed. It's like, I'm gonna be the suave rescuer that comes in and tricks these guards and makes the magic walk away, and I saved you. Walk with me. Oh, watch out, these bad guys are coming. Oh, now you're involved. Let's fly away. Like, are you kidding me? Like, that was did a 5th grader write this? This is the dumbest introduction to a character I've ever seen. And then the whole part, we literally know nothing else about him except that he disappears into this black void and comes out like this bird creature, which again is magic we are never given any rules for. We don't have any explanation of. And then the only other character note we have about him is that he's this overly melodramatic guy that flips out when his hair is dyed and then sinks into a puddle of slime monster. Like, really? Okay, this is the guy we're supposed to like? Like, that's why I was like, is this a Beauty and the Beast, like, knockoff? Where it's like, oh, see, he's really immature and he's vain and he cares about his looks. But watch, he's going to realize by getting to know Sophie, who's this old lady who has nothing appealing to look at, and he's going to learn that beauty is on the inside, which is the biggest stereotyped typical plot ever. But we didn't even get that plot point, that he's like, oh, well, now he knows that, like, it's what inside that matters. No, he doesn't learn or grow or change at all. He just gets saved when Calcifer's has water thrown on him, which again, that plot point made no difference because she threw water on Calcifer, and for some reason, no rules, he's not dead and Hal's not dead, so that whole point of peril was useless for that too. The only other, I tried to, like, figure out, like, what is it about Hal that we're supposed to know? Like, what is it about him that we're supposed to know and care about? Sophie talks about that he just wants to be free, but we don't really see any example of that or how that would benefit him or how he's not currently free, except that he has a bunch of aliases. Sophie spouts his praises and talks about how he really is good, like he's a good person, but we don't see any evidence of that. It's just because Sophie says that she is. And then we find out later that she's in love with him. So is she just looking at him through rose-colored glasses and he's really not a good person? Like, the only thing else we know about him is that these people in the village thinks he eats the hearts of pretty girls. And I guess that's not true because we didn't see it happen. But it was just, like, the most vague thing ever. And then all of a sudden he, like, has a Beauty and the Beast moment where he gives Sophie this, like, cottage and this flower field, and it's like, if you like it that much, it's yours moment. You could open up a flower shop. Who says she wants to open up a flower shop? She has a hat shop, and we don't have any indication that she wants to do anything like open up a flower shop. Well, just because you gave it to her, like, what was the point of that? Why? I don't care that you can open up a flower shop at this field that I'm letting you look at and live at. Like, what? That was so nonsensical. And then he has this big, like, oops, I've changed moment where he's like, I'm tired of running away because now I have something I want to protect, which gag me. That's so dumb. And like, how like heavy-handed can we be with that? And it's like, well, we haven't seen you run away at all, except that you've said that you don't want to report to the king to go fight in the war because you don't agree with the war, not because you want to just run away. And then we've seen no indication that you want to protect Sophie out of any affection for her, let alone like loyalty to her. Like, you haven't had any kind of like relationship develop or bond build with her. Like, but now all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you're like, I'm not running away anymore. When were you running away? You just gave her some flowers and were like, had a meltdown and turned into a slime monster. Like, we don't know anything about this guy except what is more or less just like thrown at us in this weird exposition that doesn't seem to have any firm basis that we've seen. Mm-hmm. It's kind of the epitome of we're just telling you everything. Just trust us that what we tell you about these people is accurate, but we're not actually going to show you any evidence of that. And so that's mostly what I mean by the fact that there's not really any depth. And then also, Madame Solomon has this big oops, I've changed moment. And she's like, oh, you know what? Let's not have a war anymore. Like, okay, so was it her idea to go to war? Like, we didn't get any information about the war plot, but now all of a sudden she's like, maybe war's not a great idea.
Okay, thanks.
All done. Let's quit, guys. Like, it was just so goofy. Like, I felt like I couldn't figure out the age demographic of this film because I think that there could be some very, like, I wouldn't say dark as in like bad, but some pretty heavy, dark, themes that take a little more higher intellectual levels to kind of process, like with the whole war plot, the prince being like the fact there's so many plots. Mm-hmm. Like the average like 5th grade child is not going to be able to compile all of this together. But then the characters are so shallow and flat, and they have these weird moments that are inconsistent with what we've seen prior. That is this like for kids? Like, is this designed for like a 5th grader who just wants to like watch the cool animation and like who cares if there's no depth because it looks cool? It was just very confusing for me. The Witch of the Waste I thought was a stupid, useless character, except for the fact that she curses Sophie. Like, she could have stayed off screen for the rest of it, or have Madame Solomon curse Sophie. Just throw the Witch of the Waste out as a character. She's completely unnecessary. And then I really found it frustrating that, like, after she is, like, old, she, like, loses all her brain cells. She's, like, stupid until she, like, has Howl's heart and doesn't want to give it up. And now all of a sudden she's, like, regained her intellectual capacity. I was like, this makes no sense. Like, is she really old and dumb now because she's so old she's senile? Nope, apparently not. She can still like have full conversations, but then she's gonna like her 2 words she's gonna say for 30 minutes of the film is nice doggy. Like things like that just
pretty fire. Yeah,
it was just ridiculous. I really don't have any notes about any of the other characters because they were frankly just completely forgettable. The Scarecrow, the turnip head Scarecrow character, like, I thought he was pretty great. He kind of saved the day, like, when he's a scarecrow and you're just like, oh, he's kind of a cute little sidekick character that kind of makes these, like, little cameos here and there. I mean, it was cute, but again, it didn't really contribute much until they just, like, I feel like it was just plot convenience that they decided to just make him the prince at the end. And then Calcifer and Marco as the other characters, again, they're not bad. They're generally likable. Like, all the characters I feel like are generally likable, but other than serving some kind of plot convenience, with Calcifer being the having Howl's heart, and Marco, you need somebody to open the door so that Sophie can even get in the house and like have somebody to talk to. Other than like those two kind of plot points, like, what are they there for? They really don't serve much purpose. So overall, that's kind of my summation of the characters. I just thought they were really poorly developed. So that's why I gave half a point out of 3.
Okay. All right. So for characters, for me, out of 3 points, I gave this 1.5 points. So again, I agree with a lot of what you said, but I weighed character design in this category instead of aesthetics. So that's where a lot of the positives come from, I think, for me. But I'll just kind of talk about it. So I think the biggest problem with the characters is that I think individually, each character has this amazing potential and a very distinct self to them. I think what happens is because the plot is so weak and vague and confusing and messy, there is no foundation for these characters to start on or go to. And that's their biggest downfall. And it's really not the fault of themselves as characters. It's everything that should support your characters is flawed. And so that's the biggest reason that I think they suffer in so many ways. I think that individually, they're really nicely crafted and created. And I think for the most part, there are exceptions to this, each character kind of has its purpose and fulfills that purpose. However, there is an exception to this. I agree with you, your note about the Witch of the Waste being basically a useless character. I think they nerfed her by making her an ally halfway through. Just completely ruined that whole dynamic. And I'll talk about her a little bit more in a minute. But I think the depth of the relationships between characters, that's what you strive for when you are storytelling and also as an audience member. That's really what they want to see more than anything else. It's not so much this character acting independently on their own and what their capabilities are, but how that character interweaves with every other character that appears and has an interaction with. And the depth of these characters' relationships does not make any sense or much sense to the audience members because we do not get enough moments amongst each other that carry any sort of significant emotional weight. And this also kind of goes back to the plot in that we do not understand the motive of basically everybody. So because of that, it's hard for us to navigate the how and why this character is saying this to this character because we don't understand the motive. So you rated characters a lot lower than I did. And I think that's perfectly valid. I'm just trying my very best to separate the characters from the plot, which is, I think, the biggest downfall of the character, is because they're the characters delivering the story, and the story is built on quicksand. So I feel like the characters are doing the best that they can do. They just don't have any foundational direction to go in any capacity. But let me talk about each of them individually. So I think Sophie is a very, very charming character. She's very humble. What I found funny, and I don't know if this was intentional, is she seems to be more confident and bold when she is old than she is when she is younger. And I don't know if that's an intentional purpose or if she feels like because she's already not herself that she can act a little less like herself. But it's not so far removed that she is like a complete 180 of herself as she is young. And I think there is a lot of charm to her in that sort of humble way. And that, Sophie's goal in life is not presented to be fame, money, even romance. Like that's not something that Sophie presents as aspirations of hers. Like she's perfectly content just working at the hat shop and living kind of a quiet life. And I think there's a little bit of charm to that. And it kind of gives sort of a small town feel. And I think it makes a very good parallel to Howl, who is a very mysterious, lavish, sort of vain, rich sort of character. And I think they're two very different people. And so I think the potential that is there for their relationship even romance aside, just like working together to a common end or common goal, there's so much potential there. And I think it's really a shame that their relationship is nerfed so much by the plot, because they are so different, and yet they do grow like a mutual like care, affection, and respect for each other. I just wish I understood how they get there. You know what I mean? It's like you see the growth, you see them warm up, but like you said, you know, at the end, Sophie says, I'm in love with you, but like, how did you get there? Because number one, Hal doesn't spend as much time at the house. You know, he's off doing wizard things, and that's established, you know, and it's part of the reason that Markle is a character, because Hal's not always home, but there's still like business to be done. And so he's kind of like his assistant. So like the purpose of his character drives home the fact that like Hal's not present all the time. And then when Howl is present, it's not like he and Sophie really get any like one-on-one individual time to really like understand, or like, I don't know how else to describe this, but to kind of like learn each other. Really the biggest significant like alone time moment that they have is when he takes her to the field. But that scene is so strange because you don't really see the steps to get there, other than Sophie takes care of him, but she's taking care of the whole house. So by proxy, of course, she's going to kind of take care of him. Like when he has his little emotional meltdown or whatever, when he gets hurt and he's, you know, up in the bed or whatever. And so it's like she's really not doing anything extra for Howl that she's not doing for Markle, Calcifer, or even the Witch of the Waste after her powers get taken away. She's being herself, and I think it's a good depiction of her consistency as a character, but it doesn't lend any sort of indication that there's something more or there's something special between her and Howl. And so, like you said, it kind of makes you scratch your head and be like, well, why do you love him so much? Did you trauma bond because of the whole war thing? Which, if that's the case, please make that clear, because it's not clear. Or is it literally that you're just so pretty and like, I just want to have a boyfriend as pretty as you? Because that's a really shallow reason and isn't really in line with Sophie's character and her like very humble self, where that's not really something that she seeks after. So it's just very confusing, and I think it just leaves you feeling like you are told what the characters end up as. You don't actually see the progression happening. And I think that's just a big shame, and like is a lot of potential that's kind of missed in regards to the two of them. I think Howl is great in his design. And I think that Christian Bale did a really good job with his like dub, you know, as his English dub, and all of that. I think he's presented in all of the ways, but I just wish I understood what he wants from life a little bit more. And I know it's kind of like a piggyback note off of everything else that I've said, but I just wanted to say it again. Markle, which is it Marco or Markle?
I don't know, to be honest.
I think it's Markle.
I thought they were saying Marco, like Marco Polo.
The only reason I say that is because I watched it with the subtitles on, because I'm an old woman and I like to watch everything with the subtitles on. And I'm pretty sure it was like Markl was how his name was like spelled. So I think it's Markle, but I'm not 100% sure. I like him. As a character, he's very like fun and like he's very witty for a boy his age, but I keep thinking to myself, how did he get here? I don't think that's answered. No. Like, who are you? Where did you come from? Did Howl kidnap you? Like, who are you and what relationship do you have with Howl? There's no backstory really given, and it's very confusing. I think that the Witch of the Waste is the worst character in the whole movie. I'm sorry, but she's annoying from the beginning. She doesn't really get any better when she's switched from enemy to ally. And then she just kind of takes up space until the very end, when she basically makes a dumb decision after Sophie makes a dumb decision. And then it doesn't actually matter about the dumb decisions. There's no actual, because all the stakes that we thought we knew turn out not to be true. So she really is kind of a waste. And I think what should have happened is, if they really wanted to use her, when her powers got stripped, she should have been removed. Like, off stage, you're done. And I think it maybe would have lent itself to have this sort of like almost more wariness or even fear of, what's her name? Lady Solomon?
Yeah.
Solomon?
Madam Solomon.
Madam Solomon. I think as an audience member, if I had watched our enemy get stripped of her powers and then banished or put away to rot or whatever, I would have been more scared, especially as a younger child, of this sorceress right here. Like, okay, so now she can just do that at her will? Like, so she just, and next she's going to decide that she doesn't want Hal to have his powers anymore, and now what does that mean for Calcifer and Markle and even Sophie at that point? So I think it would have been a much more interesting choice, not just for plot, but for characters as well. And I think it would have lent itself for us to be a little more fearful of now our new villain who has taken the spot. If they're going to switch antagonists halfway through the movie, I think that it needs to feel really weighty, and it just doesn't. I wish that the character of Turnip Head was given a more, I know I kind of already talked about this, but like given a more satisfying conclusion. Because I do think it feels like, how are we going to explain this away? Okay, we'll use the Scarecrow. And it is a surprising choice, and so maybe if that's what you're looking for, that's what you like. But I genuinely look at it and I'm like, it just feels like a cheap, this is the easiest way to explain this. And I think it really diminishes his sort of like contribution to the plot, as this, he steps in very early to kind of help Sophie, and then, you know, his curse is lifted or whatever, he's a real boy again, and then there's not much follow-up. Like, does he continue a friendship with them? I don't know. Like, none of that is really answered, and so it just feels like he appears early, he's kind of present as like an ally all the way to the end, and then he's just done. Like, and so I just don't like that. I'm really sorry, but all of that to say, I did only give it half credit because I think individually each character is really good. They just don't work well together. And so it's hard because I wasn't sure like how to weight this. And so I kind of just like put most of the responsibility of those negatives on the plot and not so much on the characters. So I really kind of debated, and I ended up just going with 1.5 points because I really do think that the character design is really, really nice, and that, I do like how each character is animated and has their own sort of distinct, even like color schemes are kind of given to each character. And I think everybody looks exactly how you would want them to. Like, if you were reading the book, they do match. They match what your brain picture kind of conjures up. So I think that they all look the way they should and perform the way they should. And I appreciate the animators even including silly things like Markle, every time he goes out of the house, he wears like that dumb little disguise, and it's just like the little beard, and like his eyes are different, and it's like even just like little things like that where Markle literally holds himself differently when in disguise, I think are really good character notes. And I just feel like they had so much potential, and it's unfortunately just nerfed by the shaky foundation that is everything else. So 1.5 points out of 3.
Okay, so next category is aesthetics. So out of 2 possible points, I gave this 1.5 points out of 2. I think really the visuals are where Studio Ghibli films just really shine, and I think that's the primary reason that these films have stood the test of time, is because of the visuals. So a lot of positives of that. I do think just initially when we open the film, the visuals we're given in the opening of the film are really well establishing. It gives us a sense of time. It gives us a sense of kind of this mechanical, like steampunk kind of style. It gives us this establishment that there are there's an element of fantasy in this world, that there's magic in this world, and it's all blended really well with very realistic bits and pieces that we can kind of ground into our base knowledge. Overall, the visuals are extremely intricate and detailed. For example, the scene where Sophie goes into Howl's room and there's all that stuff on the wall and there's all these like little knickknacks and pieces and, you know, trinkets, and the design of the house is just, the castle is just feels really organic, but yet it feels very mythical, but it also feels very just grounded in reality. Overall, I think the visuals are just really, really good. The animation style of the kind of anime style, if you will, I think is done really well in a cinematic way. So the characters look like anime characters, but the overall cinematography of the film feels like a in-camera film. They don't have any of those really cartoonish comic book style cuts or sequences. There's not moments where the characters, you know, face shapes change or their eyes change kind of in like manga or anime style cartoons. So I like that we still have this very distinct Japanese animation style, and yet we keep it all very, very cinematic. You know, camera angles, the way the camera kind of moves throughout the environment, if you will. Even like the background paintings, I think that in this style, from at least from what I can tell, there appears to be that nice blend in traditional animation of like painted backdrops with foreground cell animation style. Yeah. I like that it has that visual feel, even if it may be using digital technology versus the physical, you know, plates and cells in traditional animation style. Specifically, I like this moment. This is kind of a broad note, but the animation style of Calcifer, who is supposed to be fire, his animation style looks really good for fire, which is extremely difficult to animate. And the way that he moves, the way that his character kind of sits on the logs and kind of climbs and moves, and he has little tendrils that kind of look like hands, and he eats, you know, things. Like the logistics of Calcifer, I think we do have good rules of kind of who he is as a character and what he needs to live in his world. And then you contrast that with, you know, not to be stereotypical, but then contrast that to the water when Sophie is mopping the floor, and the water that spreads out on the floor. It looks very anime style, traditional animation style. It looks very different from Calcifer's fire. He doesn't look like a cartoony style fire. The water, I would say, looks like a very hand-drawn, technical visual of water kind of like washing across the floor, and yet they feel like they fit in the same environment. They feel like they fit in the same world. And so they didn't try and make the water look as 3D as Calcifer does, and yet it's still believable in the world that we're watching. There is there are some moments where I think that, and of course this is kind of the early 2000s of film and traditional animation styles, there are some moments where it appears to me, I have not looked into this extensively, for example, Howl's Castle, when it's moving, appears to be CGI. So it's done digitally in digital, you know, media. Now, they could have done the entire film in a digital software and program, which a lot of traditional style animation is now done digitally versus traditional hand-painted, hand-drawn. But there are some moments where I do feel like the CGI and the traditional styles don't blend perfectly well. And that is, in a sense, a product of its time. But I do think that visually, for me at least, and I'm a layman, I'm not an animation major. I'm not my knowledge of animation is DVD commentary, so I would say I'm a lay person. I think that if it's a little visually distracting, that kind of breaks that immersion, because I'm seeing a character in the foreground who doesn't look like they're actually in the environment as that digital art in the background. I think that gives you a little bit of disconnect as a viewer. But overall, I think the character styles are really good. I like how each character is very stylized and very identifiable. I mean, tiny little nuances and details that are taken into consideration with the costumes that different characters wear, or when Sophie steps out into the town and she looks up and all of these buildings have these pink and yellow flags draped across all of them. The style concepts of their little motorized air scooter kind of things, is great. The visuals of the warship are really done well. Any war scenes where you have these huge airships and then the little like minion-y wizard minion things coming out, that I feel like is good. It's really strong visually, but that's like another moment where it's like the airship looks like it's CG and then all of the characters look like they're traditionally hand drawn, and so it just doesn't quite blend very well. I think the visual storytelling is really good. The use of light and dark, when Howl goes into this kind of dark chasm where he's essentially going to war and fighting in this war, I guess. Howl's character visuals, how he kind of changes and has these feathers. I think all of that is just done really, really well. It's very intricate. It's very detailed. And I just think it's done really, really well. I don't have any notes about other aesthetics as far as like the soundtrack goes, because I think that in watching this film, a lot of the sound design, the sound effects, the score, all of that was really not noticeable, which is exactly where you want it to be with sound. So I appreciated that I didn't have these moments where I was like, oh, this soundtrack seems really weird. Although there were moments where I felt like, oh, this feels really nice. Like this moment feels, a little cozy or a little nostalgic. And it was because that score kind of came in and lifted to help lend to the mood. So overall, I don't have a ton of notes for aesthetics. I did think there were some things that were kind of goofy. I thought Howl's kind of bird form at the end looked kind of wacky. I didn't really particularly like it. I thought it looked a little cheesy. The visual style choices they made with the Witch of the Waste when she loses her powers, I just thought it was really kind of comical looking and goofy. It to me, like you mentioned before, I think that would have been a great moment to instill fear into the viewer of Madame Solomon's power. I think it just made it kind of laughable and comical, because here's this character that just looks really goofy and acts really goofy. The dog at the end that goes up the steps with Sophie and then she ends up taking it home. I thought the dog was just stupid, a useless character. And the fact that he just has this wheezing sound effect, I understand it was most likely done for comic relief, but it feels like it was done for the 5-year-olds in the audience wanting to watch the silly dog. And so those were some like specific notes that I particularly didn't like. The visuals, although I didn't like it in a story aspect, when Howl kind of has his meltdown and like it's coated in slime, I thought visually it's pretty impressive, because I couldn't tell specifically if that was a nice, I mean, thinking about it now, I can't recall if that was a blend of traditional and digital, or if it was all digital, but I thought overall it looked really good. But from a storytelling aspect, I thought visually it was kind of goofy. It kind of takes you out of the moment a little bit visually, because now I'm not really concerned either way, because it's so off the wall and out there that it feels like I've just watched a different movie now. I've changed the channel and I'm watching a different TV show or a different movie. But overall, I think the visuals and the aesthetics of this are really where this film is done really well. And I think that's why Studio Ghibli is just so, it still has the legacy it has, is because they take so much time and attention to these little details and to really crafting and building the world as a whole. So that's why I gave it 1.5 points. I think there were a few moments where it was a little visually, I don't know if there's a term for like unimmersion, like didn't immerse you. But overall, it's done really, really well. So 1.5 points out of 2.
Okay. For me, for aesthetics, I gave this full 2 points. I kind of really wanted to critique this, and I couldn't find anything specifically that I thought was wrong or bad. I wasn't really bothered by any of that stuff that you noticed, although I don't think that's a bad thing. It was just something that I didn't find a need to like take any points off. But yeah, absolutely stunning animation, and I think that's really what Studio Ghibli is famous for, is this very specific style. You know, it is a Japanese studio, so you do have sort of that anime aesthetic to it, but it is cinematic, and it's meant to be. And I think that they have a very obvious, good working knowledge of like cinematography. Even if it were like a live action, I feel like you would have a lot of very similar shots. It's just animated, and I think that that's good, and I think it helps kind of widen the audience in general for a Ghibli film. Coloration is just absolutely stunning. I feel like that's something that we don't really talk about a lot, but I want to just make a quick note of it, because I think that everything is just colored in such a lovely way. And I think that each character kind of has their own like color palette, or and it all kind of fits in the world and the setting that's around. I think that the setting is even really cool because it sort of has this grounded in reality, like could be a real place vibe, but then you have magic and like all these, you know, sort of steampunky elements like you mentioned. And so it's like obvious that it's not a real place, but it still feels like it could be. And then it also, for timeline, it's like you kind of have this traditional, almost like turn of the century kind of vibe, industrial revolution kind of vibe. But then some things are like very kind of future forward, and so you're also not sure exactly where it kind of falls in the history of the world. And I think that those are things that if you tried to think too hard about, you wouldn't really come up with an answer. But I don't think it's a bad thing, especially aesthetically, because I think it helps lend this sort of like suspension of disbelief, in that this is kind of like a new magical place that doesn't exist in our world, and that's okay. I think the score is absolutely lovely. Kind of like you mentioned, it's very understated, but still effective. I think a lot of the pieces are recognizable and even iconic, I would say, especially for fans of like Studio Ghibli films. There are certain score pieces that I think are just really iconic and memorable for the movie, but yet they're never loud or like distracting or off-putting in any way. Everything always fits with what you're seeing visually. And on that note, to kind of segue, I think that this is really, really good mixing in regards to an animated film. I think that it's really easy, especially with animation, to forget to balance things in a way that feels realistic. Because when you are, especially like with acting, so like when you're acting on a screen, your actors are going to get louder or softer depending on mood, space, like a bunch of factors, you know, and then of course you can always change things in post, but for the most part, a lot of your like volume control is being done by your actor or the person speaking, or whatever outside things might be moving. So in regards to sound effects or Foley, you know, all of those things are kind of moving independently and you have to mix them together. And I think that it's even more noticeable in animation because when you have an actor who's standing this close to a microphone in a booth, you have to be very careful about how you mix that in, because if you leave it as it is, it's going to sound unnatural, especially if somebody is recording in a booth that's 5 by 5 feet, but then you put that, it's for a scene where you're supposed to be in like a big cave or something like that, and the space is going to be very different. The quality of sound is going to be very different. And I think that they have treated each piece of audio in the exact appropriate way for this movie. And that's one thing that I think you don't think about when you're in the movie, and that's exactly what you want, is you don't want your audience to think, oh, this sounds like it was not recorded in a cave, or this sounds like whatever. Like it should be so natural that it just doesn't even register. It just is bought as it's happening on on the screen. And I think that this movie really does a great job at that. And yeah, I think the CGI is really, really good for its time, 20 years ago. And I think looking at it now, and it's still holding up pretty well. I think to compare it kind of to another movie, I think it kind of feels like the way that like Treasure Planet did. Similar time frame, I guess. I think they were only a couple years apart or whatever.
Yeah.
So, but I think that where like both films did kind of everything just right, I think. And while it's not quite as perfect as it could be now, and there are some moments where you can kind of tell that there's a different cell laid on top of this, I think for the most part you look back and you don't cringe at it, where I think sometimes you can look back at animation that was done that far back and be like, oh, that does not look very good right now. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think everything still looks really good. And there are also other moments I want to acknowledge. The scene actually near the beginning, which I know you don't like the scene, but it's the scene when Howl appears for the first time and he's kind of escorting Sophie. And there's a scene where they're literally just walking, and it's like walking left to right. And you can tell it's two different cells layered on top of each other. It's like the alley and then it's them moving. And the way that they track the movement, it's almost like the cell layer that is Howl and Sophie moves just slightly faster than the cell of the alley moving. And while that sounds like it could look like it doesn't match, what it does is it achieves a camera effect. So it looks like the perspective of that alley moves the way it would if this was a live action, because as you get farther away from those bricks, they are going to move at slightly different pace than your actors, because your actors are closer to your camera. And so situations like that's just one example of many in this movie, where having those layers, those cell layers of separation, which again, I am also a layperson in regards to animation, so I'm talking with the best knowledge that I have, which may not be 100% accurate, but having those different like cell layers, I think really does lend itself to some really beautiful like camera moments, because it does make it feel real. Like this is a real camera that's really moving to track these actors. And I just really, really appreciate the thought and effort put into that, because it is more work to animate different cells at different paces. But the result of that extra effort, I think, really helps kind of sell the immersion of what you're looking at. And I think they do that so, so well. I also think, last note really, actually, I have two more notes. The lighting effects are really, really beautiful. There's a lot of different lighting. And I appreciate that the color temperature changes depending on what that source of light is. That's something that's not always present in animation. But in real life, indoor lighting has a different color temperature than the sunlight does, and fluorescence and things like that. And so I appreciate the extra effort gone in, so that if there's sunlight coming through a window, you can see almost the difference between the light coming in through that window and then perhaps a lamp or calcifer's glow. And there are different colors and they blend them so nicely. So it does look like you're getting both, kind of both temperatures or colorations of those lights without it looking like, it's like a stark stop right here. Like everything is just blended very nicely. And it does, again, kind of lend this, evoke this feeling of realism to that, which is, you don't think about those things. And that's not even counting, some of the more, I guess, dramatic lighting scenes, where you have like just a candle or just the moonlight or something, and it, evokes a lot of shadow and things on characters or the setting, to, give a mysterious vibe or a serious vibe or something. And those are all done really well as well. But I just wanted to commend work for that, because it's really easy to just like light a torch but then the whole room looks perfectly lit. Mm-hmm. And you're like, that doesn't actually make any sense, because in real life that torch would only have so much of a circumference of light around it. So the attention to that sort of thing, I think, is worth noting. And I really think that, so one thing I kind of mentioned earlier is that this film and other films in the Studio Ghibli world, I guess, or franchise, they have the classic Ghibli nonsense, and where, characters may change in appearance in like a very like grotesque or dramatic way. And it could be really, really off-putting or feel like now you're looking at something that's not from this world. And when that happens in this film, it happens primarily with Howl and then with The Witch of the Waste, I think are the two biggest examples. But even Sophie herself in her aging. And I want to commend the fact that even in weird shifts of character and or setting, it all still feels cohesive to the world. And even though young Sophie looks very, very different than the Witch of the Waste, they both still look like they belong. And even when both of those characters change very drastically, they still look like they belong in the world. And that has to be more of a challenge than I would know. So I wanted to make note of that as well. So I really couldn't think of anything that I really had critiques about for the aesthetics. So that's why I went with full points, 2 out of 2.
Alrighty. So next category, as always, personal taste and preference. Only allowed 2 points for this. I actually gave this half a point for personal taste and preference. I really don't dislike this film, but I don't particularly like it either. It's one of the films I think is decent entertainment if you don't think too hard about what's going on. And this is going to get me a lot of hate, but the more I try to buy into Ghibli films, the harder it is for me. And my general impression of this film is just okay. So it's not gonna, be something that I really rewatch or anything like that. It's just kind of, that's an okay film. And I think that it's a good, like I said, if you don't think too hard, I would say it's a good introduction to Studio Ghibli films because it probably has, of the plots, even though they are kind of jumbled, I think that it does have the most, I guess, not the most. I haven't seen all of the Ghibli films, but I would say the plots are very easily identifiable, and most people can kind of track them and understand the general concept. Everybody can understand that a war has happened. A prince has gone missing. This girl is cursed. This witch is the bad guy. The Howl is this mysterious potential love interest. So kind of like I said all the way at the beginning of the episode with plot, I think that I would recommend it to somebody who's like, I want to start watching Studio Ghibli films. Which one should I start with? I really would recommend this film to that individual. But personally, it's just not my thing. And it's not at any discredit to the fans of Studio Ghibli or even discredit to people that just love this film. But that's why I only gave it half a point out of 2.
So for me, for personal taste and preference, I gave this 1 out of 2 points. It is entertaining for me and it is nostalgic for me, but I really don't have the attachment to it as I do to a lot of other films that kind of came out in this era. I think I was much more attached to like Disney around this era than I was Studio Ghibli. And even though this was around the time I think that Disney started kind of distributing Ghibli, so it was accessible to me and I did watch it. It just didn't like stick in the same way. So I just don't have like all that nostalgic attachment to it. Like I acknowledge it for what it is and I appreciate it for what it is, and I know that the fan base is very wide and international and all sorts of people love these films, and I think that's great and I think it should be that way. I consider myself to be on the very casual side of watcher. I don't know if I would necessarily call myself like a deep fan of this. I watch it and I enjoy it and then I move on with my life. I'm not really collecting Ghibli t-shirts and figurines and cute things like that. And if you're one of those people, great. I'm glad that you are. I'm just not one of those. And I think that's okay. But I liked the book. I talked about that kind of briefly. I think it's a pretty good adaptation, at least to my remembrance. But the lack of clarity at times makes this film feel muddy. And if I were to say which one is better, I would say probably go with the book, because at least the book has the time to flesh out the plot points that exist. And maybe the adaptation would have lent itself better to something like a series, maybe not a movie. So I just think that it's not the best that they could have done, I think, with the source material. And so maybe this is kind of dipping into my creativity a little bit, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it's kind of one of those things where if somebody was like, hey, you want to watch Howl's Moving Castle with me? I'd be like, yeah, let's do it. But if I'm like sitting around at home and I'm like, what do I want to watch personally? It's not the thing I'm going to pick all the time. It'd been years since I'd watched this. And Ghibli, while I enjoy it, is not something that I'm like, I got to watch the next Ghibli film. I'm years behind on Ghibli films. I don't think I've seen a Ghibli film since like Kiki's Delivery Service. I think that's probably the newest one I've seen.
Well, and it's older than this movie.
Oh, well then I don't know. Maybe this is the newest one I've seen. I really am super behind on Ghibli films. So I wouldn't even call myself a deep enough fan to like keep up with the releases. But again, I'm not opposed to ever watching them. It's just not the thing that I'm constantly seeking out. So 1 out of 2 points.
Alrighty, so last category is creativity. So total possible score of 1, and I gave this full points. So 1 out of 1. Although I'm overtly critical of Studio Ghibli's plot and character sections, I don't think anyone can debate that the visuals are great regardless if these films are for you. They commit to their own style in both art and narrative, and I think for an quote-unquote independent Japanese animation studio to continue to have the ability to compete with Disney, Pixar, DreamWorks, and Illumination, and only release one film every year or so is exactly what this category is for, and I think it warrants full credit even for this individual film as a standalone. So specifically, I looked into it. This was nominated for an Oscar for Best Animated Feature. It was nominated for, if you go on the IMDb page, which I did just very briefly, it's nominated for multiple international accolades. Mm-hmm. So this Studio Ghibli, although I think you could in essence argue that Studio Ghibli gets the creativity, this film may not necessarily merit that. I think you could argue it because this film was critically acclaimed.
Yes. And
the box office, I think you mentioned, it was like almost
236 million or something.
Yeah,
crazy.
Almost $240 million internationally. I think that it's pretty impressive that this film alone did have such a widespread reach and widespread appeal. And I think that in a way, this era of Studio Ghibli was one of the, I think it was maybe the second film that was distributed by Disney, John Lasseter. I think the first film he pushed to distribute for English-speaking audiences was Spirited Away. Yes. And I think this was the second one. So the dubbing and the distribution being for an English-speaking audience, was still very new in its time. And now almost all Studio Ghibli films have an English dub and are released to an English-speaking audience. Yeah. I keep trying to correct myself because I know it's not just English people that are watching this film.
Right. English speaking.
Yeah. And so that gives it even more of an audience. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that in general, I mean, I don't know the inner workings of Studio Ghibli, but you wouldn't think that this tiny little animation studio, and it's probably not tiny at this point, but this animation studio from this, tiny little chain of islands in Japan, which Japan's huge and they have a huge widespread reach with technology. So I'm not discrediting it, but it's like could compete with these huge heavy hitters like DreamWorks, Pixar, Disney at the time. Yeah. Those were that was the forefront of animation. So I think it's very impressive that a very distinct animation style, this Japanese animation style, is very distinct, and it tends to not appeal to the masses. Most of the people that watch these style of animated films kind of stay in the corner of manga and anime, and that's all well and good, but this has reached the masses. Like the same people that want to go see Minions they're still going in and taking their kids to see Studio Ghibli films. And so I think that that's very, very impressive. And I commend Studio Ghibli for committing to the way that they want to design, like their animation style. They've committed to it. They've never swayed from it. And they've committed to their style of storytelling. One of the things I kind of forgot to mention in the plot was the pacing of this film. There was moments where it's paced really slow. Like shots a character moving across a frame or light moving across the floor, Studio Ghibli takes its time in telling you the story, and it has not really swayed from that either. And so I commend them for doing what they do and doing it well. And I think that specifically is why we have this category of creativity. And so I don't think you could give it anything less than full points.
Okay. And for me, for creativity, I also gave this a full point. I echo a lot of what you said. I think the fact that Studio Ghibli is a name that if you are familiar with animated works really of any kind, you know that name. Even if you're like us and haven't seen every film, if you know what Studio Ghibli is, you know the name Howl's Moving Castle, even if you've never seen it. And 20 years have gone by. And the fact that people are still watching Howl's Moving Castle, they're still fans of this movie and everything else in the franchise as well. Merch for Howl's Moving Castle is still being produced and still being bought by people. There's still fans to this day for this movie that's now 20 years old. I think you cannot discredit that. And the fact that, like you said, Studio Ghibli is still there. They're still making movies. They do it the way they want to do it, and they storytell the way they want to storytell, and people are still going to see it. And even for their like English voice dubbing actors, they're getting big names. These are not nobodies. Billy Crystal, Christian Bale, like these are big names just in this film. They just got Robert Pattinson for their newest film. And so it's like, it's not like this is a little company that's just kind of like putting out films as they can, and maybe they have like a weird niche following.
Yeah, like direct to DVD. It airs on one random channel on cable network. It's really not
like that. Yeah, and I think that it's really become an iconic name in animation. And to look and see how many films they've made, it's not the volume of something like DreamWorks or Disney, but it still has that lasting impression on anybody who is familiar with animation, to have that sort of working knowledge of Ghibli. And I think that, some people can say like, oh, well, the late 90s, early 2000s was kind of the Ghibli golden years. And that may or may not be true. Again, I'm really behind on Ghibli films, so I don't have any sort of opinion on that. And you may think or say that, but I think the fact of the matter is that they're still making films, people are still going to see them, and they are still making a profit. And I have to commend them for that. But even specifically for Howl's Moving Castle, I would say Howl's is probably one of, or not, if not the most popular title of Ghibli, maybe tied with Spirited Away, or Castle in the Sky. Those are probably like the top three. And I would say, those names, even if you've never seen the movies, like, those titles, if you know anything about animation, if you watch animation in any capacity. So yeah, kind of like you said, it is classic Ghibli weirdness, but I think that's the fans of Ghibli walk into Ghibli films knowing that's what they're going to get. And their legacy hinging on that, I don't think is a bad thing. It may not be for me, it may not be for you, but I think that acknowledging that is who Ghibli is, and they are not really ashamed of that, I think is to be commended and noted. So full creativity points.
Yeah, and the fact that they've stuck to it for this long. They haven't said, oh, we need to get with the times and make something that looks like, we need to change our animation style to reflect Cal Arts, or to reflect the Pixar, style, or the Disney style, because that's what makes money. It really feels like when you're watching it, like this was an individual's passion project.
Yeah.
And they were just going to make the movie they wanted to make.
Yeah. And it lends a big feeling of like heart into each film. Like, even if I think it's kind of weird and I'm not really following, at least it feels like somebody cared. Yeah. About what they made. And I also wonder, I didn't mention this in my scoring, but I also wonder if some things just don't translate well to an English speaking audience. That's very possible.
Think culturally, there are obviously cultural differences between Japan and America, or Japan and Europe, or, there clearly are cultural differences, but I wonder if that also is just a facet of Ghibli that, you know, in my culture, it just doesn't appeal to me the way it does for the people in Japan.
Right.
You know,
it doesn't resonate the same or whatever.
And I also wondered if the English dub doesn't allow for translation to be as well. It's like we have...
Like it's not as accurate as the original writing intended.
Right. Or, you know, even some things like, you know, when we have stories in English and somebody is named something very specific because that word has a very specific meaning in English, if you were to translate that into another country's language, you would miss that.
The weight of that kind of diminishes.
Right. Or if the, you know, the dialogue is meant to have this conversation and, you know, we have words in English that are homonyms. They sound like one thing and they really mean something else. And so there's this artistic, poetic, you know, double entendre going on. We would absolutely miss that in English, going from Japan to English. So I wondered if, because I do feel that Ghibli films are very artistic, they're very intentional and artistic about things. I wonder if there are some things that just literally get lost in translation.
I could see that happening,
both in verbiage and cultural translation.
Yeah.
So I
think it's worth acknowledging for sure.
Yeah. So I don't say that to alter my scoring, but in the same way that we reviewed in one of our prior seasons, we reviewed Day 6's album.
Yeah.
I kind of made the point, like, some of this just doesn't translate to me because I don't speak Korean.
Right.
And so I think that in the same way, there is probably some moments in Ghibli films that just don't resonate with American or Western audiences because we don't have that Japanese culture background as a frame of reference.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think so. It's a good thing to acknowledge.
That was just a little side note, an addendum to you know, add on there.
Okay, so do you have any other? Oh yeah, final score. My final score is 6.5 out of 10.
And my final score is 4 out of 10.
Okay.
So,
okay.
4 is not bad. It's not like 40%. Like it's a, you know, like it's a
it's not a
math
test grade.
Score.
Yeah.
Like 4 is not bad. I think that people, I was watching somebody on YouTube and they were talking about, they're asking somebody to score something out of 10 and they were like, 5 is average.
Yeah.
Like a 5 out of 10 is average. Yeah. So like middle of the road, like the absolute middle. 10 is like off the charts.
Right.
You know? So 4 is not a bad score. I want to be clear with that.
Are you ready for some lightning round?
I am.
All right. Question 1.
Okay.
Favorite character?
I think we'll see, when I was watching the film, I would have said the Scarecrow.
Turnip head.
Yeah. But then the little cop out, they're like, oh, he's actually the prince at the end, kind of like ruined it. Mm-hmm. And they even like copped out. They were like, your true love's kiss will break the spell. I guess your true love's in love with someone else. So then she wasn't his true love. So they even copped out with that. But I think I would still say him. I don't like that part. I would say him or Sophie. Mm-hmm. So
I would say Sophie or Calcifer. So
yeah,
both good characters, I think. Okay, favorite scene. Do you have a favorite scene?
It's a good question. I liked the scene. It's again, it's kind of like that little slice of life scene kind of thing, but I like the scene where Sophie is like cleaning the house and then they have breakfast together, which again, it's like you mentioned, it's like that slice of life scene, but just visually it's so nice to look at. Like the attention to detail on like the background of their like living room, like all this like little knickknacks and books and all this, you know, stuff, and so I just liked the visuals inside of Howl's castle because it was just so many details, and I just really liked that. Yeah. So it wasn't necessarily for the story moment per se, but I just thought visually it was just so impressive.
Yeah, mine is similar. It's the scene where the castle parks, I guess, by the big like lake. And Sophie is just taken aback by the lake. So she goes and she's sitting by the lake for like hours. And you see like the day kind of moves by. She finally like gets up and is ready to go back in the house. And Markle just kind of like helps her in. And it's just like so sweet. But like the way that like the camera angle kind of shows like that whole lake. And it kind of it just feels like a really nice moment where Sophie can just have some time to herself, because she doesn't get that really anymore. And her established character is that, you know, she is very humble, and so I think her alone time would be very valuable to her, and so to have that moment just kind of at the lake to reflect is just like a little nice moment. And I know it didn't really have anything to do, any lasting impression on the plot, but I just think it's a really lovely scene in general.
Yeah.
So, okay. So you know how Howl's castle has 3 locations that when you flip the ring, portal door, it opens into 3 different places, technically 4, but the 4th is always like, you know,
it's off limits.
It's off limits. So if you could choose 3 locations that the front door of your house would open out to, what 3 locations would you choose?
Ooh. That's a really...
And you're not committed to these forever.
Oh, that's
because
true.
you can change them if you have a magic house.
Yeah.
You could change them. But like today.
So just like today.
Like let's say you had to commit for 30 days. And then so
I would pick work because it'd be way easier because our traffic is terrible. So I'd pick work for one, just out of utilitarian purposes. I'd pick work for one, which is kind of a throwaway. So now I got 2 more. I think I would pick... I would pick like 2 places I like would want to travel to. So like exciting, quote unquote exciting places. So I think I would pick one place in Europe because you can get to a lot of other places in Europe. So it'd be strategic. I don't know. Maybe I would pick like Amsterdam because I've never been there. And then I could get to like other places in Europe from Amsterdam. So I'll just pick that one. I mean, Germany would be good. France, you know, lots of places. But I'll just pick Amsterdam because I haven't been there yet. And then my 3rd place, I think I would pick somewhere I would either pick somewhere in the U.S. that I would want to visit, but I feel like that's a little bit of a cop-out. I think I would pick... I think I'd pick Sydney, Australia, because I've never been there either. Yeah. So I've always wanted to go to Australia. And then I would pick Europe. And then in 30 days, I could kind of swap stuff around. So, yeah. Yeah. I think that's what I would pick.
So I think for me, I would also pick work because convenience. The second one, I would pick a Disney park.
Ooh.
And I could just open into a Disney park.
And you could go inside the park so you wouldn't have to pay for a ticket.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Wouldn't that be cool?
That'd be pretty great.
And then for 3rd, I would do like a rotating place that I've wanted to visit internationally. So someplace like Venice or the Netherlands or Sydney, Australia was an idea I had as well. So that's what I would pick for my 3.
It's a good idea.
Okay.
I would pick the... living room and the bathroom.
You can already walk to those places in your house.
Right. But then I don't ever have to leave my bedroom.
So if you had a magical ability, what would you want? This is kind of like if you had a superpower, really but you can't pick
question.
You can't pick teleportation because your house front door already does that. I have the door
already.
So that one's off limits. So if you had magic, but your magic only does one thing, what do you want your magic to do?
Well, but only one thing. This is like a genie in a bottle because you could like say anything. Like, I mean, I'd be like, oh, I would want to be able to shapeshift into anything. And then if I wanted to like fly, then I could just turn into a bird. Or if I wanted to like get out of
specific
work, I could go. But that is specific. You know what I'm saying? Like, so it has to be like a superpower ability.
Yes, but we're gonna call it magic.
Okay. Because I'm just saying you could go really broad.
We're calling it magic, but it is basically that question. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if I could have a superpower, I've always said that if I could have a superpower, I would want to be able to fly. I just think that would be great. And then if I had my magic door, then I could literally travel wherever I wanted to go.
That's very true.
So I think I would pick that.
That's very true.
I would want to have endless money. That would be my
would
my
be
magic.
nice.
I could print money and it would be legal.
That would be nice.
Can that be my magic power?
Yeah, it can be.
Okay, I'll pick that.
Okay.
Then I could...
bottomless bank account.
Yep. I mean, that you could do a whole lot with that.
You could do a whole lot with that.
Yeah.
I think I would... since teleportation is normally my answer, but that's off the table because my friend already does that. I think it would be nice if I could duplicate myself, but still keep full conscience in all my duplications so that I could go do multiple things at a time. So like one of me could go to work, but then the other me could like go do something fun, and I would have full consciousness and memory at the end of the day when I fuse back together.
So you'd be like multiple man.
Yeah, basically. That would be cool, I think.
But would you have to fuse back together?
No, I don't think so.
How many times could you multiply yourself, though? Infinitely?
There should be rules to the magic. There should always be rules to magic.
Magic.
I would say maybe 3 of me could be possible at a time, max.
Well, can you use your teleportation door, all your clones?
Yeah.
Your copies?
Yeah.
You could, like, work 3 jobs and be, like, a gagillionaire.
True. I could. Or I could have one of me lay at home and be lazy.
What if
lazy schlub.
one of you got mad? The one of you that had to work got mad and didn't want to have to work anymore and wanted to swap with somebody else, then what?
There should be fair shift changes.
Okay. Or you could just, like, reabsorb them.
Yeah.
And then you could just be like, too bad.
Yeah.
Now you're going to work.
Right.
Clone.
Yeah. There should be fair shift changes.
If there's like 3 of you and you merge back together, when you make a duplicate of yourself again, does that duplicate have like consciousness of the last time? So like you send your clone to work and they come back at the end of the day and they're like, I don't want to go to work tomorrow. And you're like, okay, fine. And you just like reabsorb your clone and then you duplicate a new clone. Is that the same clone as last time? That didn't want to go to work, and now you're sending the same clone back to work again?
We're establishing rules. I would say, yes, it's the same clone, but then for the sake of fairness, it should be either my original self or my other clone that should go to work that day.
What if it's your original self that gets stuck doing all the work and all your clones get to go have all the fun?
No, they don't get to do that. Now a clone has to go to work.
Well, how do you know?
How do I know?
Like, all the clones, so you just have 3 clones that have to change shifts working. What if they're like, hey, you've never had to work, you're gonna have to go to work now?
Yeah.
They gang up on you. You're saying no, they're not allowed to do that?
No, they can. I would go to work.
See, I don't like this deal because now
I'm trying to be fair.
Well, I just think that you're giving your clones too much.
We're talking too much about authority.
This now. See, you gotta make rules for your magic.
Yeah, it's true. Okay, last question.
Oh, that wasn't even the last question.
One more question.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Of all the Studio Ghibli films that you've seen,
how
does this one rank comparatively?
Honestly, I feel really bad because I can't remember a lot of details about the other ones that I've seen.
Sure.
So of the ones I've seen Spirited Away, Howl's Moving Castle, Princess Mononoke, Castle in the Sky, Kiki's Delivery Service. We watched that together. I feel like there's another one that's like similar to Kiki's.
Have you seen Ponyo?
I've not seen Ponyo.
Okay.
I think those are the
Whisper
only ones.
of the Heart.
No, I haven't seen that one. Okay. I think those are the only ones I've seen. And
Totoro? Have you seen Totoro?
I fell asleep during Totoro. Okay. I had a late night shift. It was a long day. So technically I've seen half of Totoro. I think I would rank this one of those, like just personally, how I like them. I would probably say above it would be probably Spirited Away, Castle in the Sky. I can't recall as much how much I liked it. I'd probably equate it with Princess Mononoke. So like between 3rd and 4th place, I guess. And then above Kiki's Delivery Service and Totoro. Yeah, because that's 5, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so probably in the middle. I just don't recall Princess Mononoke very well, and I don't recall Castle in the Sky. It's been a while since I've seen it. So as far as how like the pacing goes, but like, and how much I would enjoy watching those now, because it's been a while since I've seen them. So I'd say probably in the middle.
Okay.
But I also, I think, to be fair to like Studio Ghibli fans, the ones that I've seen are pretty like popular ones. So I don't have good comparison with like maybe the less popular films.
The more niche ones of the franchise. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that the, Spirited Away and Castle in the Sky would necessarily be above it in that specific order. But that, So, yeah.
Okay.
Probably in the middle somewhere of those films.
Okay. I've seen basically all the ones that you just listed. The one I remember the least is probably Castle in the Sky, but everything else. Mononoke used to be my favorite film. I don't think that's the case anymore. I would actually probably put Howl's Moving Castle at maybe 2-ish for me. I don't really know what my favorite one is right now. Maybe it is Howl's. I don't know. Maybe it's still Mononoke. I think I'd need to watch them like in succession to really make like a good gauge.
Yeah.
I still love Princess Mononoke, but I've had this weird phenomenon happen to me where the more I watch that film, the less I like it, which is really strange.
Yeah.
But that's what's kind of happened to me. So while Mononoke used to be my number one, maybe it's not anymore. I don't know. But I also don't know which of those other films I would put in its place either.
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just all over the place with Ghibli. So I don't really have a good ranking. But maybe I think I would put Howl's at maybe 2 or 3-ish.
Yeah.
So.
Alrighty.
But anyway, that's it. Any other thoughts?
Nope. I'm good.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. We hope you had a good time, because we know that we did. If you had an idea of what we should review next, you can leave us a comment. Use our suggestion box on lionandmousepodcast.com. You can also find on our website links to our show notes, Patreon, and socials. And if you could please review this episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, YouTube things like comment, subscribe, tell your friends, share, that sort of thing. Word of mouth really helps us out as well. It helps us reach as many people as we can, and we appreciate all the support. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you in the next one.